There's something undeniably magnetic about a promise, not just any promise, but the kind that echoes through centuries, the kind that binds a person's very soul to their word. Picture this: a knight kneels before his lord, armor gleaming in the flickering torchlight, his voice steady as he swears an oath that will define his life. This wasn't just ceremony, it was a sacred pact, a vow so powerful it could shape kingdoms and forge legends. In the medieval world, chivalry wasn't just about swinging swords or winning glory. It was a way of life, a code that demanded courage, compassion, and unbreakable loyalty. And at the heart of it all lay those extraordinary oaths, the promises that turned ordinary men into icons of honor. Think about the weight of those words, what it meant to pledge your life to something greater than yourself. These knights didn't just swear to fight, they vowed to protect the helpless, to stand for justice even when it cost them everything. Their oaths weren't scribbled on parchment and forgotten. They were etched into history, stories so compelling they still stir our hearts today. From the legendary tales of King Arthur's Round Table, where knights like Lancelot and Gawain bound themselves to ideals higher than any throne, to the lesser-known but equally gripping vows of obscure warriors who held fast to their duty against impossible odds, these weren't just medieval rituals. They were acts of extraordinary faith in the power of a promise. So what made these oaths so enduring? Why do we still feel a thrill when we hear of a knight's unshakable loyalty, even centuries later? Perhaps it's because deep down we all long for that kind of certainty, the idea that someone's word is their bond, that honor isn't just a concept but a living, breathing force. In this video, we'll journey back to a time when vows weren't just spoken but lived, tracing the footsteps of knights who turned their oaths into legacies. You'll discover how these pledges shaped battles, inspired revolutions of the heart, and left a mark on history that still whispers to us today. This isn't just a story of swords and shields, it's a testament to the power of a promise, and how the echoes of those sacred words can still inspire us to live with a little more courage, a little more loyalty in our own lives. To truly understand the gravity of a knight's oath, we need to step back into the world that shaped them, a world where land, loyalty, and faith were the pillars of society. In the early days of feudalism, a knight's word wasn't just a personal pledge, it was the glue holding entire kingdoms together. When a young warrior knelt before his lord and swore fealty, he wasn't just making a promise, he was binding himself to a system where trust meant survival. This was an era before standing armies, where a lord's power rested on the shoulders of those who pledged to fight for him. A broken oath wasn't just dishonorable, it could unravel the delicate balance of power, leaving castles vulnerable and villages unprotected. But these vows weren't merely political. The church saw an opportunity to temper the raw violence of knighthood, weaving spiritual duty into the warrior's path. Imagine a young knight, sword laid upon an altar, as a bishop intoned sacred words over him, his oath now blessed, his duty sanctified. This fusion of martial might and divine purpose gave chivalry its soul. Suddenly, a knight wasn't just serving his lord, he was answering to a higher calling, one that demanded mercy for the weak and justice for the oppressed. The legendary Roland, dying at Roncesvalles Pass, didn't just fight for Charlemagne, he fought believing heaven itself watched his final stand. The most powerful oaths often unfolded in spaces designed to awe. A candlelit cathedral, the echoing hall of a king's court, or even the open field before battle, these weren't casual backdrops. They were stages set to remind every witness that this promise transcended the moment. When William Marshal, arguably the greatest knight of his age, renewed his vows before Henry the young king, the ceremony wasn't just about allegiance. It was theatre of the highest order, reinforcing that a knight's word was the currency of his honor. And in a world where reputation could mean the difference between celebrated hero and forgotten outcast, that honor was worth more than gold. What's fascinating is how these traditions evolved from practical necessity into something almost mythical. Early feudal oaths were straightforward contracts protection in exchange for service. But as tales of Arthur and his knights spread, the ideal grew grander. Now, a vow wasn't just about obedience. It was about becoming a living emblem of virtues like courage, courtesy, and fidelity. This shift didn't happen overnight. It was the work of poets and priests, warriors and kings, all shaping an ethos that would endure long after the last castle fell. When we hear these stories today, we're not just hearing about medieval customs, we're hearing the birth of an idea that still whispers to us about what it means to give your word and to keep it no matter the cost. Every gesture in a knight's oath carried the weight of centuries. When a warrior knelt, it wasn't just a show of respect. His bent knee pressed into the earth symbolized humility, a deliberate lowering of the self before duty. The act of placing his hands between his lords wasn't merely a formality. It was a physical surrender, a transfer of agency. His life was no longer fully his own. And when his fingers brushed the cold metal of a relic or the hilt of a sword, he wasn't just touching objects, he was binding himself to something eternal. The relic tied his promise to heaven's judgment, the sword to the deadly consequences of failure. Language, too, was weaponized for permanence. These weren't casual words mumbled in passing. Oaths were crafted like incantations, rhythmic and heavy with intent. A knight might swear by the cross and the iron, invoking both divine and earthly power, or pledge to serve without faltering while breath remains in this body. The phrasing mattered. It turned a fleeting vow into a cage for the soul. Breaking it meant more than losing honor. It risked divine wrath. Medieval minds believed heaven kept score, and a perjured knight might find himself barred from salvation, his name cursed in sermons for generations. Consider the relics often used in these ceremonies: a saint's fingerbone, a fragment of the true cross. To modern eyes, they might seem like macabre props, but in that world, they were conduits to the sacred. Swearing on them wasn't theater, it was summoning witnesses beyond the mortal realm. The church understood spectacle. A bishop presiding over the oath might hold the relic aloft, sunlight catching gold as he intoned, "Remember before God and these assembled the cost of falsehood." The message was clear. This promise echoed in eternity. Even the setting played its part. A great hall draped in tapestries, a chapel thick with incense. These weren't random backdrops. They were psychological fortresses designed to overwhelm the senses and sear the moment into memory. The flicker of candlelight on polished armor, the scent of wax and sweat, the hushed silence of spectators, all conspired to make the knight feel the eyes of history upon him. And then there was the sword, the ultimate symbol, laid across an altar or held point down like a cross. It wasn't just a weapon but a covenant. To swear upon it was to say, "May this blade turn against me if I lie." The consequences of betrayal were equally theatrical. A knight who broke faith might face diffidation, a formal ceremony of disgrace where his lord would publicly break a rod, declaring bonds severed. Lands stripped, titles revoked, his shield hung upside down in shame. These weren't just punishments but performative undoings, rituals to mirror the broken oath. Some chronicles even speak of traitors' effigies dragged through streets, their names scraped from records. The message was unmistakable. In a world built on trust, betrayal was a contagion to be purged with fire. Yet for all their gravity, these rituals weren't rigid monoliths. A clever lord knew when to adapt. Facing battle at dawn, the oath might be sworn hastily over a campfire. the relic a simple pilgrim's badge. A peace treaty between rivals, the ceremony would sprawl for hours, laden with chants and exchanged gifts. The core remained the unshakable idea that words, when properly consecrated, could forge bonds stronger than stone. What's striking is how these medieval minds understood psychology long before the term existed. Every element, the tactile, the visual, the auditory, was engineered to make the oath unforgettable. The knight didn't just hear his promise, he felt it in his knees on the cold floor, tasted it in the communion wine afterward, saw it in the flicker of candles reflected in his lord's eyes. This wasn't just about loyalty, it was about crafting a moment so potent that walking away from it would feel like tearing out part of one's soul. And in that alchemy of gesture, word, and belief, ordinary men became legends. Among all the legendary oaths sworn by knights, none shine brighter or cast darker shadows than those of King Arthur's Round Table. Here was a brotherhood bound not just by steel, but by sacred words that turned warriors into symbols. When Arthur's knights gathered around that famous table, its circular shape whispering equality, they didn't just pledge service, they swore to live by a code that would make or break kingdoms. To right wrongs, to protect the weak, to show mercy where mercy is due. These weren't empty phrases scribbled in some dusty chronicle. They were battle cries for the soul, a radical idea that strength existed to serve goodness. Take Sir Gawain, whose oath of courtesy faced its ultimate test when the Green Knight's axe loomed over his neck. His story wasn't just about survival. It was about what happens when a knight's word collides with human fear. Gawain's small lapse, accepting a magical girdle to cheat death, haunted him not because it cost him victory, but because it proved even the noblest vows could crack under pressure. That tension between ideal and reality is what makes these legends timeless. The Round Table didn't demand perfection, it demanded accountability. When Gawain returned wearing the girdle as a badge of shame, he showed more honor in his remorse than any flawless deed could convey. Then there's Lancelot, the knight who embodied both the glory and ruin of chivalry. His oath to Arthur was absolute, yet his love for Guinevere became the poison that unraveled Camelot. Here's the tragic twist: Lancelot never stopped believing in his vows. Even as he betrayed them, he clung to the fantasy that he could serve both his heart and his king. That's why his story cuts so deep. It reveals how oaths, once broken, don't just fail. They metastasize. Every secret meeting with Guinevere wasn't just adultery. It was a slow sabotage of the very ideals that gave his life meaning. Arthur himself understood the terrible power of these promises. When he established the Round Table, he wasn't creating a club of elite fighters. He was engineering a revolution. In a world where might usually equaled right, Arthur's vision flipped the script. Now, a knight's worth was measured by how he treated a starving peasant, not just how many enemies he felled. That's why the Round Table's collapse resonates like no other. It wasn't just a kingdom falling. It was the shattering of an audacious dream, that men could govern their baser instincts through solemn words. What's remarkable is how these medieval storytellers weaponized failure. The greatest Arthurian tales aren't about knights who kept their oaths flawlessly, but those who stumbled yet refused to look away from the damage. When Tristan betrayed King Mark for Isolde, when Percival failed to ask the Grail's healing question, their stories didn't end with their mistakes. They became parables about the long road back to honor. That raw humanity is why we still tell them centuries later. In a world full of easy compromises, Camelot's legacy whispers a haunting question. What's your word really worth when keeping it costs everything? The Round Table's brilliance lay in its impossible standard. These knights didn't swear to try or to do their best. They vowed absolute fealty to principles that no mortal could perfectly uphold. Yet that very impossibility gave their struggle meaning. Like a candle flickering in a storm, their oaths shone brightest against the darkness of human frailty. Perhaps that's the truest lesson of Arthur's legend, not that vows make us perfect, but that they give us something worth failing toward again and again, until our stumbles become the story itself. Godfrey of Bouillon's oath wasn't just a pledge, it was a fire that scorched across continents. When he knelt in the great church of Clermont in 1095, joining thousands of other knights answering Pope Urban II's call, he wasn't merely vowing to fight. He was surrendering his destiny to what medieval minds saw as the ultimate sacred mission, the liberation of Jerusalem. This wasn't feudal loyalty to a mortal lord. It was a covenant with heaven itself, sworn on relics and sealed with the sign of the cross, and it thrust Godfrey into a gauntlet of hunger, betrayal, and bloodshed that would test his vow at every turn. What set Godfrey apart wasn't just his skill in battle, though that was legendary, but his unwavering grip on the chivalric ideals woven into his oath. While other crusader lords squabbled over spoils during the grueling march east, Godfrey refused to let petty ambitions taint the sacred nature of their quest. His humility became his strength. When Antioch fell after a brutal siege and lesser knights reveled in plunder, he ordered his men to guard the city's Christian refugees, honoring the protector of the weak clause buried in their crusading vows. In that moment, the abstract ideals of chivalry became flesh. A dusty, exhausted knight standing between trembling civilians and the chaos of victory. Then came Jerusalem. By the time Godfrey's forces reached the Holy City in 1099, the crusade had become a graveyard of broken promises. Knights who'd sworn solemn oaths had perished or deserted, their bones littering the roads from France. But Godfrey's resolve only hardened. When his army breached the walls after a month of starvation and failed assaults, he did the unthinkable for a medieval conqueror. He refused a crown. The chroniclers tell us he wouldn't wear gold where Christ had worn thorns, accepting only the title, Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. In that choice, he elevated his oath beyond politics, making himself not a king, but a living instrument of the divine will he'd sworn to serve. Yet the true measure of his vow came after the fighting ended. With Jerusalem secured, most crusaders raced home, their oaths fulfilled, not Godfrey. He stayed to govern a fractured kingdom, negotiating with rival factions, distributing alms to the poor, and drafting laws that blended Frankish and local customs. Here's the paradox: the knight who'd wielded a sword so fiercely now wielded mercy as his primary weapon. His court became a beacon, where Muslim travelers later wrote of his surprising fairness, and where the orphaned children of fallen enemies found shelter. This was chivalry's highest expression, not just conquering for God, but ruling with the compassion their oaths demanded. Godfrey's death just 1 year later, likely from typhoid, cemented his legend. Pilgrims flocked to touch his tomb, whispering that a man who'd kept his oath so completely must be a saint. Modern historians might debate his motives, but the medieval world had no such doubts. To them, he embodied the perfect fusion of faith and knighthood, a warrior who understood that the strongest vows aren't those shouted in battle, but those lived in the quiet aftermath when the banners are furled and the hard work of integrity begins. His story whispers across the centuries a simple truth. An oath isn't truly tested when it's easy, but when every instinct begs you to break it. Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, the warrior history remembers as El Cid, knew the bitter taste of exile. Cast out by King Alfonso VI of Castile under false accusations of treachery, he stood at the cruelest crossroads a knight could face. His lands confiscated, his name tarnished, his very honor questioned. Yet even as the gates of his homeland clanged shut behind him, He refused to let bitterness unravel the oath he'd sworn. This wasn't blind loyalty, it was something far more profound. El Cid understood that true fealty wasn't conditional on fairness. His vow wasn't just to a king, but to the very idea of knighthood itself. So what did he do? The exiled warrior didn't raise his sword against Castile, though many in his position might have. Instead, he turned his talents to the fractured frontier of medieval Spain, offering his services to both Christian and Muslim rulers, not as a mercenary, but as a man clinging to purpose. Here's the twist: even while fighting under Moorish banners, he never truly served them. Every battle he waged, every fortress he secured, was done with one eye always turned back toward Castile. His victories in Valencia weren't just conquests, they were love letters to the kingdom that had cast him out, proof that his oath still lived in exile. The brilliance of El Cid's story lies in its messy humanity. This wasn't some flawless saint marching through history. He schemed, negotiated, and sometimes bent the rules, but never broke them. When King Alfonso, humbled by El Cid's unwavering honor, finally lifted the exile, the knight didn't return in triumph to gloat. He came back as if no time had passed, his loyalty untouched by years of injustice. That's what makes his legend endure. In a world where betrayal often begat more betrayal, El Cid chose a different path: to answer cruelty with constancy, to let his actions rewrite his story. And what actions they were! His capture of Valencia wasn't just a military masterpiece, it was a masterclass in chivalry under fire. Instead of pillaging the city, he established a court where Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived under equitable laws, a radical act in 11th century Europe. His famous sword, Tizona, became more than a weapon. It was a symbol that true strength lay in justice, not vengeance. Even his enemies respected him, not because he was invincible, but because his word was iron. When he finally died defending the city he'd built, his enemies wept. El Cid's tale whispers an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, keeping your oath means serving a cause greater than the person who holds it. His loyalty wasn't to Alfonso's flaws, but to the timeless ideals Alfonso represented. That distinction is what separates blind obedience from the kind of devotion that outlives kingdoms. Centuries later, when Spanish poets sang of El Campeador, they weren't just praising a skilled fighter, they were celebrating a man who proved that exile couldn't break a knight's word, only test its mettle. And in that fiery testing, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar forged something even more unbreakable. A legacy that still reminds us honor isn't about never falling, but about how you rise when the world tries to keep you down. The blast of Roland's oliphant horn could have saved him. That haunting detail lingers at the heart of his legend, the fact that he possessed the means to call Charlemagne's army back, yet chose silence over the slightest hint of dishonor. As Saracen forces closed in on the pass at Roncesvalles, outnumbering his rearguard 10-1, Roland's companion Olivier begged him to sound the alarm. But the knight's pride burned brighter than his survival instinct. Better death than disgrace, he growled, gripping his sword Durendal as if it could carve his name into eternity. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a slow, deliberate martyrdom, each fallen foe a stepping stone toward a death he'd already accepted. Roland's dilemma cuts deeper than medieval heroics. It lays bare the paradox at the heart of chivalry. How do you serve a king who isn't there to see your sacrifice? Charlemagne, miles away, would never have known if Roland had blown that horn a minute earlier. But Roland would have known. That's what makes his choice so devastating. It wasn't about practicality, but about a private standard of honor no one else could judge. Modern soldiers might call it unit cohesion. that unspoken bond where letting down your brothers feels worse than dying. Roland took that idea to its logical extreme, valuing the symbol of his loyalty more than the life that could prolong it. The poet who crafted the Song of Roland understood the seductive danger of such devotion. Notice how the tale lingers on Roland's final moments, not as a triumphant last stand, but as a lonely reckoning. With Olivier dead and most of his men slaughtered, the knight finally raises the Oliphant to his lips, not for rescue but for vindication. The blast splits his temples, a visceral price for his delayed pride. Even then, he staggers toward a nearby tree, arranging his sword and horn like sacred relics before whispering a prayer that's equal parts confession and defiance. This isn't the clean heroism of tapestries. It's a raw portrait of a man married to his oath, even as it buries him. Historians still argue whether Roland was brave or merely stubborn, whether his refusal to compromise saved the army or doomed his men. But perhaps that's the wrong question. The real power of his story lies in its uncomfortable mirror, forcing us to ask where we draw our own lines. Every parent who works themselves sick to provide, every employee who burns out trying to meet impossible expectations, they're all facing Roland's choice in softer forms. When does commitment become self-destruction? When does duty cross into obsession? The medieval world had a term for Roland's brand of loyalty, desmeasure, the fatal lack of moderation. It's telling that later versions of the legend soften his ending, having angels carry his soul to heaven. Even medieval audiences couldn't quite stomach the idea that such devotion might go unrewarded. But the oldest manuscripts offer no such comfort. Roland dies because he chose to, because his oath mattered more than survival. And in that stark, unvarnished truth, he becomes something far more compelling than a perfect hero, a warning etched in blood and poetry, reminding us that the vows we think define us might also be the ones that break us. William Marshal's story begins with a noose around his neck. At just 5 years old, he was dangled over castle walls as a hostage, his father famously declaring he'd make better sons rather than surrender to King Stephen's demand. Yet from that brutal introduction to feudal politics, Marshal would rise to become the gold standard of knighthood, not through brute strength alone, but by turning his vows into an unbreakable compass. What's astonishing isn't just that he kept every oath he swore, but how he navigated the murky waters of medieval power without ever letting pragmatism corrode his honor. Consider his early years as a landless knight-errant. While others pillaged villages for quick riches, Marshal gained fame through tournament victories, his adherence to fair play earning him something rarer than gold, trust. When the young King Henry, son of Henry II, rebelled against his own father, Marshal faced an impossible choice. Bound by oath to serve the prince, yet loyal to the crown, he walked a razor's edge, protecting his reckless charge while secretly ensuring the rebellion failed. It was a dance of integrity few could manage, fulfilling his duty without betraying his deeper principles. The true test came decades later, when Marshal was nearly 70. With England teetering on civil war after King John's death, the aging knight was named regent for 9-year-old Henry III. The rebel barons smelled blood, offering Marshal power and lands if he'd abandoned the boy king. His response became legend. Even if all abandoned him, I alone would carry him on my shoulders from island to island. This wasn't empty rhetoric. At the Battle of Lincoln in 1217, the septuagenarian knight led the charge himself, his swordwork so fierce it inspired terrified whispers that death had taken human form. But here's what makes Marshal extraordinary: his loyalty wasn't blind. He'd openly opposed King John's worst excesses, even facing exile for it. Yet when John died, leaving a child heir vulnerable, Marshal put aside past grievances to defend the throne. That's the nuance modern retellings often miss. Chivalry wasn't about mindless obedience, it was about discerning which promises transcended personal feelings. Marshal understood that some oaths weren't to individuals, but to the very fabric of order itself. His deathbed scene captures this perfectly. After decades of service, the knight who'd never lost a tournament or broken his word lay dying, surrounded by weeping monks. When asked for final counsel, he didn't boast of battles won. Instead, he whispered, "I cannot defend myself before God if I do not return what was given." True to form, he distributed his wealth to the poor and posthumously fulfilled a decades-old vow by joining the Templars in death. Even his enemies attended his funeral, their presence the ultimate testament to a life where every word had weight. Marshal's legacy shatters the myth that medieval oaths were shackles. In his hands, they became tools, a way to navigate chaos without losing oneself. Where Roland's rigid devotion led to tragedy and Lancelot's divided loyalties bred ruin, Marshal showed that true honor lived in the spaces between black and white. His life whispers a lesson we've never needed more, that integrity isn't about never bending but knowing what must never break. Joan of Arc heard voices where others heard only silence. At 13, in her father's orchard, celestial whispers called her to an impossible task: drive the English from France and crown the Dauphin king. This wasn't just piety, it was a vow etched into her bones, one that would defy every expectation of her era. No sword-fighting lessons, no noble bloodline, just a peasant girl from Domremy who dared to believe heaven had chosen her. When she finally stood before Charles VII, her conviction cut through courtly skepticism like sunlight through stained glass. "I bring you news from God," she declared, and something in her steel-eyed certainty made a desperate prince take the gamble of his life. What followed rewrote the rules of medieval loyalty. Clad in white armor crafted just for her, Joan didn't just inspire troops, she transformed them. Before her arrival at Orleans, French soldiers fought like mercenaries, their oaths brittle as old parchment. But when this teenage girl rode into camp refusing to tolerate swearing or brothels, demanding confession before battle, something miraculous happened. Hardened knights began policing their own ranks, not out of fear, but because her presence reminded them of the sacred purpose they'd forgotten. Her vow wasn't to a feudal lord, it was to what she called the King of Heaven, and that higher allegiance became contagious. Suddenly, charging English fortifications wasn't just about payback, it was a crusade. The siege of Orleans revealed Joan's genius for turning faith into strategy. While seasoned commanders debated tactics, she bypassed war councils entirely, acting on what she called her counsel, those divine whispers. Her decision to attack the fortified Les Tourelles seemed suicidal until the French standard, clutched in her hands, touched the outer wall. Then, as chroniclers recorded, a strange fervor seized her men. They fought like souls possessed, scaling ladders under a rain of arrows, and by dawn, the impenetrable stronghold fell. Joan took an arrow to the shoulder that day, yanking it out herself as blood soaked her surcoat. Later, she'd weep over dying English soldiers, urging them to repent. This was chivalry stripped to its essence, ferocity in battle, mercy in victory, all bound by an oath that made no sense to earthly logic. Her trial exposed the raw nerve she'd touched in medieval society. The English didn't just accuse her of heresy, they fixated on her clothes. Those infamous men's garments became proof, they argued, that her divine mission was a fraud. But Joan's rebuttal cut deeper. "For nothing in the world will I swear not to arm myself and put on a man's dress." Her refusal wasn't stubbornness, it was the ultimate test of her vow. To renounce the armor would mean denying the very identity heaven had given her. When judges demanded she submit to the church's authority, her reply shook the courtroom. I answer only to God from whom I received my mission." In that moment, an illiterate farm girl outmaneuvered the finest theological minds, exposing the hypocrisy of those who wielded religion as a weapon. Flames at Rowan couldn't erase what Joan had proven, that vows weren't about titles or gender, but the courage to live them. Decades after her death, when the church that condemned her canonized her as a saint, it wasn't just an apology. It was recognition of the revolution she'd sparked. Loyalty could be a direct line between the individual and the divine, bypassing kings and popes. Modern soldiers still carry her image into battle, not because she fits the knightly mold, but because she shattered it. Her legacy asks us the same question that haunted her judges. What happens when someone's word burns brighter than the rules meant to contain it? Medieval romances didn't just entertain, they held up a mirror to the contradictions of chivalry itself. Take the tragic spiral of Tristan and Isolde, a love story that unraveled an entire kingdom. Tristan's oath to King Mark was ironclad, sworn on steel and sacrament. Yet the moment he drank that fateful potion with Isolde, his loyalty split like a cracked shield. Here's the cruel irony: the very qualities that made Tristan a perfect knight, his passion, his intensity, became the instruments of his undoing. The poets didn't condemn him for loving Isolde. They forced audiences to wrestle with an impossible question: can true honor demand betrayal? Sir Gawain's encounter with the Green Knight twisted the knife deeper. That eerie Christmas game wasn't just a test of courage, it was a trapdoor beneath the polished floor of knightly ideals. Gawain's pledge to play by the rules seemed straightforward until survival instincts kicked in. The green girdle he accepted for protection wasn't just cloth, it was the first thread pulled from his pristine reputation. What stings isn't that Gawain failed, but how human his failure was. The poem lingers on his flushed cheeks when the Green Knight reveals he knew about the deception all along. That blush is the whole point. Even the best knights sweat when their vows outpace their valor. These stories worked like pressure valves for medieval society. Outside the pages, a knight who broke faith might face execution or exile. But literature gave space to explore the gray zones. What if your lord was a tyrant? What if love and duty pointed in opposite directions? Chrétien de Troyes' Lancelot, torn between Guinevere and Arthur, became a cautionary tale about oaths that cancel each other out. The genius of these narratives was their refusal to offer easy answers. Lancelot's anguish wasn't resolved. It was immortalized, a warning that some knots can't be untied without cutting something vital. Even the props in these tales carried symbolic weight. The round table itself, that perfect circle, became a silent judge. Its shape admitted no head or foot, implying all knights were equal under the code. Yet when cracks appeared in their brotherhood, the table's geometry mocked them. How could something so balanced produce such chaos? Likewise, the green girdle Gawain wore as a badge of shame was later adopted by Arthur's court as an emblem of humility. That's the alchemy of these stories. They transformed failures into lessons, making room for growth within the rigid frame of chivalry. The afterlife of these romances proves their power. Long after plate armor rusted, printers kept churning out versions where knights faced magical trials and moral quicksand. Why? Because the central dilemma never expired: how to live with integrity in a world that won't stop moving the goalposts. Modern blockbusters still recycle these templates, from superheroes torn between love and duty to spies questioning orders. The names change, but the heartbeat remains, that moment when a character grips their oath like a cliff's edge, wondering whether holding on or letting go will destroy them. Perhaps that's why we still return to these dusty parchments, not for jousting scenes or enchanted swords, but for those raw, close-up portraits of people trying, and often failing, to be better than their circumstances. The medieval poets understood something timeless. An oath isn't truly tested when it's convenient, but when every fiber begs you to break it. And in that crucible, as Tristan and Gawain learned too late, we don't always find answers, just the indelible marks of being human. The glow of chivalry casts long shadows because where there's light, there's always the potential for distortion. For every Godfrey of Bouillon or William Marshal, who wielded their oaths as torches in the dark, there were others whose vows became weapons turned inward, corroding the very ideals they claimed to serve. Take the Teutonic Knights, those white-clad warriors of the Baltic, founded to protect pilgrims. Their order's oath to convert the heathen slowly mutated into something far bloodier. By the 13th century, their campaigns against Prussia and Lithuania weren't just military expeditions. They were sanctioned slaughter, justified by parchment-thin theology. Villages that resisted baptism were put to the sword, their lands redistributed to German settlers. What began as a holy mission became a land grab wrapped in scripture, proving how easily devotion can curdle into fanaticism when mixed with ambition. The Templars' tragedy offers a darker twist, not corruption of their oath, but its weaponization against them. For nearly 2 centuries, these warrior monks were Christendom's bankers and elite soldiers, their vows of poverty and obedience making them terrifyingly efficient. But that very discipline became their undoing. When King Philip IV of France needed cash, he realized the Templars' loyalty wasn't to crowns but to their own code. So he fabricated charges of heresy, secret initiation rites, spitting on the cross, worshipping a demon called Baphomet. Under torture, knights confessed to absurdities, their coerced words betraying the very oaths they died to uphold. The Order's Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, recounted before burning at the stake his final curse that Philip and the Pope would join him within a year, eerily fulfilled. Here, the oath didn't fail the knights, the world failed the oath. Even the noblest institutions weren't immune. The Hospitallers, famed for tending the sick, occasionally turned their Maltese stronghold into a pirate state, seizing ships under thin pretext. And let's not forget the Spanish orders of Calatrava and Santiago, whose vows to defend Christendom conveniently expanded to include enslaving indigenous peoples during the conquest of the Americas. The pattern is undeniable. When loyalty becomes unchecked power, even sacred words can be bent to unholy ends. Yet there's a haunting duality here. These fallen knights weren't mustache-twirling villains. Many genuinely believed they served God's will, that the screams of their victims were the birth pangs of a purer world. That's what makes their stories so unsettling. It's not that they abandoned their oaths, but that they followed them to monstrous conclusions. The Teutonic chronicler Peter of Duisburg wrote of massacres with the same reverence others reserved for miracle tales, proving how easily conviction can blind. Perhaps that's the real lesson lurking in these ruins. An oath, no matter how solemn, is only as pure as the hands that hold it. Without humility, without the courage to question one's own certainty, even the loftiest vows can become chains dragging us into darkness. The medieval world understood this tension. That's why their literature brims with knights wrestling with conflicting loyalties, with the cost of ideals. Because in the end, the most dangerous oath isn't the one you break, but the one you keep long after it stopped meaning what it should. Helena of Aquitaine rode through the Middle Ages like a storm wearing a crown. Twice a queen, first of France, then of England, she didn't just witness the age of chivalry, she sculpted it with her own hands. At her court in Poitiers, troubadours sang of courtly love under her patronage, weaving a radical idea into the fabric of knighthood, that devotion to a lady could refine a warrior's rough edges. This wasn't mere flirtation. Helena's influence turned the act of swearing loyalty to a noblewoman into a transformative ritual, one that demanded knights temper their brutality with grace. When young men pledged to serve her, they weren't just vowing military fealty, they were entering a finishing school for the soul. Then there were the women who wielded influence from the shadows. Take Marie de Champagne, Elena's daughter, who commissioned Chrétien de Troyes to write Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart. In that tale, Guinevere isn't just a passive prize, she's the moral compass, testing Lancelot's devotion through impossible trials. Marie's message was subtle but seismic. A knight's worth could be measured by how he honored the women in his life. Across Europe, noblewomen followed her lead, using their patronage to shape stories where female characters weren't damsels but arbiters of honor. But some women refused to stay behind the scenes. Christine de Pizan, the Venetian-born writer at the French court, took quill in hand and dismantled chivalry's gender barriers. Her book of deeds of arms and of chivalry wasn't just a manual for knights, it was a manifesto arguing that women could embody martial virtue too. With meticulous detail, she outlined battlefield strategies, proving her grasp of warfare rivaled any general's. More daringly, she chronicled heroines like Joan of Arc, framing the peasant girl's rise as proof that courage wasn't coded male. Even women barred from bearing arms found ways to enforce oaths. The Lady of the Castle of Ladies, a fictional figure in medieval romances, often presided over courts of love where knights' breaches of conduct were judged not by combat but by female jurors. These scenes weren't pure fantasy. Real noblewomen like Isabel de Fours, Countess of Devon, settled land disputes and even negotiated truces, their authority deriving from the same chivalric codes their male counterparts celebrated. The quietest revolution, though, happened in daily acts of preservation. While knights rode off to war, it was noblewomen like Aliena de Provence who maintained the estates where chivalric culture thrived. They hosted tournaments, funded chapels, and ensured troubadours had audiences, creating the spaces where ideals could flourish. When their husbands or sons broke vows, these women often became the enforcers, withholding funds or public shaming to compel honor. What emerges from these fragments isn't a sidebar to chivalry, but its beating heart. Women didn't just inspire oaths, they architected the systems that gave those promises meaning. From Elena's glittering courts to Christine's defiant ink-stained pages, they proved that loyalty wasn't about gender, it was about the willingness to hold others and oneself to a higher standard. The irony, many medieval chroniclers erased their contributions, crediting kings and warriors for ideals women helped define. But the cracks in that narrative always show in a queen's seal on a peace treaty, a patron's name hidden in a manuscript's dedication, or the echo of a lady's voice whispering through a knight's vow. The thunder of hooves, the flash of lances snapping against shields tournaments were medieval theater at its most exhilarating. But beneath the spectacle, these events pulsed with something deeper, a web of oaths that turned combat into ceremony. Before a single lance was raised, knights swore sacred vows not just to fight well, but to fight right. They pledged to respect the rules of the lists, to honor their opponents, and above all, to dedicate their victories to someone beyond themselves, a lady, a lord, or even the Virgin Mary. This wasn't just sport, it was loyalty performed in dust and sweat before roaring crowds. Take the legendary tournament at Chauvency in 1285, where over 500 knights gathered under colorful pavilions. Chronicler Jacques Bretel described how each competitor first approached the stands to swear oaths on relics, some kissing swords, others touching fragments of saints' bones. Only then did the games begin, the stakes more than prizes. A knight who broke his vow by striking a fallen opponent or using a sharpened lance didn't just lose points, he shattered his reputation. In an age where honor was currency, public shame could bankrupt a warrior faster than any ransom. The dedications added another layer of meaning. when Sir Ulrich von Liechtenstein, the real-life knight who inspired A Knight's Tale, jousted dressed as Venus, he wasn't just showing off. He'd sworn to champion the ideals of courtly love, his theatrical armor a walking vow. Similarly, at the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, King Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France staged jousts where every broken lance was proclaimed in the name of their queens. These weren't empty gestures. By tying their prowess to others' honor, knights transformed personal glory into communal bonds. What's fascinating is how tournaments became safe spaces to test dangerous loyalties. In peacetime, a knight couldn't prove his worth in battle, but he could charge down the lists with his lord's colors flying, demonstrating through skill that his oath wasn't just words. The Church initially condemned these events as violent vanity, but even clergy couldn't ignore their social glue. By the 14th century, popes sanctioned tournaments as practice for holy war, recognizing how these staged conflicts channeled aggression into ritual. The ladies watching from flower-strewn galleries weren't passive spectators. A knight who won a bout would often ride to his chosen lady's seat, offering his prize, a jeweled clasp, a falcon, as tribute. Her acceptance sealed an unspoken pact. His valor reflected her worth, her favor elevated his status. This exchange turned affection into a public performance of mutual loyalty. At the Smithfield tournament in 1390, records show French knights deliberately losing to English ladies champions as a diplomatic olive branch. Even in rivalry, oaths wove connections across enemy lines, yet for all their polish, tournaments held a raw undercurrent. The same vows that demanded fairness also bred infamous cheaters. Some knights filed lance tips to splinter on impact, scoring easy points. Others bribed heralds to announce fake dedications. When caught, their punishments were as theatrical as their crimes, forced to wear a saddle like a donkey or parade with a chamber pot helmet. These humiliations reinforced the central truth. A knight's oath was only as strong as the community enforcing it. Perhaps that's why jousting faded, but its spirit endured. Long after plate armor rusted, Olympic athletes still dedicate medals to loved ones, and modern soldiers earn badges to honor units. The tournament ground lives on wherever people turn competition into covenant, proving that the most enduring victories aren't those won for oneself, but those sworn to others. The clatter of armor couldn't drown out the sound of change. By the 14th century, a new kind of thunder rolled across Europe's battlefields, not the pounding of war horses, but the deafening roar of gunpowder. Cannons shattered castle walls that had stood for centuries, and a single musket ball could pierce the finest plate armor with ease. The knight, once the undisputed master of warfare, suddenly found himself outmatched by peasant soldiers armed with weapons that required more training to load than to use. This wasn't just a shift in tactics, it was an existential crisis for the entire system of chivalric oaths. What good was a sworn promise to fight with honor when war itself had become impersonal, waged at a distance by anonymous gunners? Yet, even as knights became obsolete on the battlefield, their ideals proved harder to kill. Monarchs still craved the prestige of chivalry, even if its martial purpose had faded. King Henry VIII of England staged lavish tournaments where knights jousted in antique armor, not for military training, but as living museum pieces. The French Order of the Saint-Esprit, founded in 1578, required noble initiates to swear oaths of loyalty, but these were now about court etiquette rather than battlefield conduct. The vows remained, emptied of their original danger but still glittering with symbolic power. The real transformation happened in the quiet spaces between wars. As Europe's nobility shifted from warlords to courtiers, chivalry's DNA mutated into something new, the concept of the gentleman. Where a medieval knight swore to protect the weak, an Elizabethan courtier pledged to honor ladies with poetry and refined manners. The sword became a fashion accessory, the oath a flowery speech. Baldassare Castigliani's The Book of the Courtier, published in 1528, was essentially a chivalry manual for the gunpowder age, its pages full of advice on how to duel with wit rather than blades, and how loyalty to one's patron now meant mastering intrigue rather than holding castle walls. Some resisted this softening of old ideals. Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote, published in 1605, was both a parody and a eulogy, a mad old knight charging at windmills because he couldn't accept that the world no longer had room for his vows. The genius of Cervantes was how he made readers laugh at Quixote's delusions while secretly mourning with him. That tension captures the era perfectly. Everyone knew the age of knightly oaths was over, but no one quite wanted to let go. The irony is that chivalry's demise as a martial code allowed its essence to spread further than ever. When the Duke of Buckingham gave his word in 17th century England, it might not have involved relics or swords, but the cultural memory of those rituals lent his promises weight. Modern diplomats still speak of good faith negotiations, inheriting a phrase that once described knights keeping vows under threat of damnation. Even today's military academies teach honor codes that would feel familiar to William Marshal, just stripped of their medieval trappings. What faded wasn't the desire for binding promises, but the certainty that they could be enforced by heaven or steel. The real legacy of chivalric oaths isn't found in dusty treaties or rusted armor, but in the stubborn human belief that words should mean something. That honor isn't just a word, but a choice we keep making, long after the world stops demanding it. The echoes of those medieval oaths still resonate in places you might not expect. Take the solemn moment when a doctor raises their right hand to recite the Hippocratic Oath. Those words about doing no harm and placing patient welfare above all else didn't spring from modern ethics textbooks. They're direct descendants of the sacred vows knights once swore on relics, transformed for a new era. The parallels are striking. Just as a knight pledged to protect the defenseless, a doctor vows to guard life itself. Both bind themselves to something greater through ritualized promises that transcend legal contracts. Scout troops gathering around campfires continue this tradition in their own way. When a young scout promises to be trustworthy, loyal, and helpful, they're unknowingly channeling the spirit of Gawain's chivalric code. The very structure of scout lore, concise, memorable, and action-oriented, mirrors the medieval commandments of knighthood that guided warriors like William Marshal. Even the scout's motto, "Be prepared," could have been lifted from a Templars training manual. What fascinates isn't just the similarity of ideals, but how these modern groups have preserved the ceremonial weight of oath-taking. The moment when a scout receives their badge carries the same solemnity as a squire being knighted. Both are rites of passage where words transform identity. Superhero stories reveal our collective nostalgia for unbreakable vows. Superman's refusal to kill, no matter the provocation, isn't just a plot device, it's a chivalric creed dressed in spandex. Batman's war on crime mirrors the medieval concept of the knight-errant, wandering the darkness to protect the innocent. Even the Marvel Universe's Captain America, with his unwavering moral compass and shield emblazoned with a symbolic emblem, feels like a lost paladin transported to the 21st century. These modern myths thrive because they tap into that ancient longing for heroes whose word is their armor. Military honor codes provide perhaps the clearest lineage. West Point's famous motto, "A duty, honor, country," could have been carved on a crusader's tombstone. The meticulous rituals surrounding modern military promotions, from the touching of swords to the reading of commendations, are secularized versions of medieval dubbing ceremonies. When a soldier recites the oath of enlistment, They're participating in a tradition that stretches back to when warriors swore fealty on crossed blades. The context has changed, but the core remains: a voluntary surrender of personal freedom for collective protection. Fraternal organizations keep the flame alive in quieter ways. The Freemasons elaborate initiation rites, complete with symbolic challenges and solemn pledges, consciously echo medieval guild traditions. Universities preserve fragments to Oxford's academic regalia, and Latin oaths during matriculation are distant cousins to a squire's formal entry into service. Even the simple act of exchanging wedding rings descends from the era when giving one's word meant offering a tangible token as collateral. What unites these modern examples isn't nostalgia for swords and castles, but something far deeper: the recognition that societies crumble without bonds stronger than law. Just as feudal systems relied on personal oaths to maintain order, we've unconsciously recreated similar structures to navigate our complex world. The doctor's oath prevents malpractice better than any regulation. The soldier's code builds unit cohesion no paycheck could buy. These aren't archaic holdovers, but evolutionary adaptations proving that certain human needs transcend time. We still crave promises that burn hotter than paperwork, vows that can't be broken without breaking something in ourselves. Perhaps that's why we keep retelling Arthurian legends and flock to superhero films. In a world of digital contracts and disposable relationships, we hunger for echoes of that medieval certainty, the idea that a person's word could be their North Star, guiding them through storms no government or app could navigate. The knights are gone, but their ghosts linger wherever people still believe that some promises deserve to be written not on paper, but on the soul. Stepping into a medieval fair today is like crossing a bridge into another world, one where the clank of armor and the rustle of embroidered tunics aren't relics but living realities. At events like the annual Tournament of the Phoenix in the Czech Republic or Pennsylvania's storied Renaissance fairs, reenactors don't just dress the part. They breathe life into ancient rituals, kneeling on sun-warmed grass as lords place swords on their shoulders, reciting oaths word for word from crumbling manuscripts. This isn't cosplay, it's time travel with a purpose. When a modern-day squire grips the hilt of a sword and pledges fealty before a crowd, they're not merely reciting lines, they're forging an unbroken chain stretching back 800 years. The precision behind these performances would impress even medieval scribes. Groups like the Society for Creative Anachronism spend years researching everything from the exact wording of 12th century Breton oaths to the proper way to fold a lady's favor into a knight's belt. At England's Tewkesbury Medieval Festival, participants recreate the 1471 Battle of Tewkesbury with such authenticity that spectators can almost smell the forged steel and trampled earth. But the real magic happens in quieter moments, like when a child watches wide-eyed as a knight swears to protect the innocent, then turns to their parent and asks, "Could I make a promise like that someday?" Beyond spectacle, these events serve as classrooms without walls. Historical interpreter Elena Swift of Warwick Castle describes how visitors often gasp when handling replica relics used in oath ceremonies. "You explain that touching a saint's bone fragment wasn't just tradition. It was like signing a contract with heaven as your witness," she says. Suddenly, their smartphone contracts seem flimsy by comparison. This tactile connection sparks something profound, the realization that our ancestors didn't take promises lightly. When reenactors at France's Provence medieval festival stage a full knighting ceremony complete with all-night vigils and blessed swords, they're not just putting on a show. They're demonstrating how seriously medieval people viewed the act of giving one's word. The authenticity movement has even birthed unexpected scholars. Software engineer turned historical researcher Mark Taylor famously spent 3 years reconstructing the exact cadence of Plantagenet-era oath formulas by cross-referencing troubadour poems with legal archives. His work revealed how rhythmic phrasing helped knights memorize complex vows, a discovery now incorporated into living history events worldwide. These weren't just pretty words, Taylor explains. The meter acted like a moral compass, the rhythm reinforcing the pledge's gravity with every heartbeat. Critics sometimes dismiss these gatherings as escapism, but the participants know better. Retired teacher and longtime reenactor Margaret Chen recounts how her group's portrayal of a 1,380 oath-swearing ceremony for at-risk teens in Chicago led to unexpected breakthroughs. One boy said it was the first time he'd seen men promise to be protectors instead of predators. She recalls, "That's the alchemy of living history. It doesn't just preserve the past, it rekindles ideals our world still desperately needs." When armor-clad volunteers at Minnesota's Northern Realm Festival intervene in mock battles to enforce period-accurate codes of conduct, they're making a silent argument that honor systems have value even in make-believe conflicts. The global reach of this movement proves its power. From Japanese enthusiasts recreating Templar initiations in Kyoto to Brazilian students staging Arthurian vow ceremonies in Portuguese, the language of chivalric oaths transcends borders. At Poland's Grunwald reenactment, where thousands replay a 1,410 battle, participants from former enemy nations now swear oaths of reconciliation alongside historical ones. The swords may be blunt, but the healing is real. What emerges from these festivals isn't nostalgia for a bygone era, but something far more vital, a reminder that words can still hold weight when spoken with conviction. As dusk falls over the tents and the last oath echoes fade, you're left with a quiet revelation. Perhaps we haven't outgrown vows after all. We've just forgotten how to wear them as comfortably as those reenactors wear their cloaks, with pride, with purpose, and with the unshakable knowledge that some promises are meant to outlive the ages. The silver screen has long been obsessed with knights in shining armor, but not all that glitters is historical gold. Take John Borman's Excalibur, where Arthur's knights swear allegiance in a haze of mist and mystic light, a scene more poetic than accurate, yet undeniably powerful. The film takes liberties with the actual wording of medieval oaths, but it captures something deeper, the visceral thrill of a promise that binds souls, not just swords. Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven takes a different tack, framing Balion's knightly vows as a moral compass in a world drowning in hypocrisy. His oath to protect the helpless isn't just a line in a script, it's a lifeline thrown to an audience hungry for heroes who stand firm when the world crumbles. Hollywood's love affair with chivalry isn't just about spectacle, it's about resonance. When a modern audience watches Lancelot struggle with his dual loyalties in First Night, or Aragorn rally his troops with a speech about honor in The Lord of the Rings, they're not just seeing medieval tropes. They're witnessing timeless dilemmas dressed in chainmail. What do you do when your oath conflicts with your heart? How far would you go to keep a promise when everyone else has stopped caring? These stories work because they strip away the dusty parchment and show vows as living, breathing things, choices that ache and exalt. Video games have taken this even further, turning players into active participants in these moral sagas. In The Witcher 3, Geralt of Rivia's code isn't just background lore, it's a gameplay mechanic. Help a village for free and you might starve later. Break your word for coin, and the game's world remembers, with NPCs whispering about the mercenary who can't be trusted. The Dark Souls series, with its cryptic knights and fallen kingdoms, turns oath-keeping into a language of its own. To pledge allegiance to the warriors of sunlight isn't just about unlocking multiplayer perks. It's about joining a digital brotherhood where emote gestures replace handshakes, and a summoned ally's timely arrival feels as sacred as any medieval vow. What's fascinating is how these modern retellings expose the gaps between romantic ideals and messy reality. A Knight's Tale plays this for laughs, with Heath Ledger's peasant jousting his way into nobility, but even its irreverence underscores a truth: chivalry was always as much performance as principle. Meanwhile, Monty Python and the Holy Grail skewers the absurdity of blind devotion. I told them we already got one, yet even satire can't kill the allure. For every parody, there's a Game of Thrones reminding us how devastating it is when oaths shatter, like Ned Stark's honor leading him not to glory but to a headsman's block. The real magic of these portrayals lies in their imperfections. They get the armor wrong, streamline the politics, and exaggerate the swordplay, but they nail the heartbeat of chivalry. It's not about historical accuracy, it's about holding up a mirror to our own world where promises are still broken, loyalties still tested, and the dream of living by a code, however flawed, still tugs at something deep inside us. Whether through a controller or a cinema screen, these stories let us try on that weighty mantle for a few hours, asking silently, could I have been that brave? That steadfast, and perhaps more hauntingly, why does it still matter? A group of fifth graders in a California classroom aren't studying math or science today, they're kneeling on foam mats, hands pressed together as if gripping a sword, reciting words that haven't lost their power in 800 years. I promise to speak with kindness, to stand for what's right even when it's hard, and to help those who need it. This isn't theater, it's part of a growing movement where educators are resurrecting chivalric oaths as tools for teaching integrity. At the heart of this experiment lies a radical idea that a 12-year-old in sneakers might connect more deeply with the phrase, "shield the weak," than with a dry list of classroom rules. The night school program, adopted by over 200 schools worldwide, strips away the armor and feudalism but keeps the core ethos. Students earn virtue badges for acts of courage or compassion, their progress tracked on a cardboard castle wall. Founder David Banks, a former history teacher, noticed something remarkable. Kids who shrugged at modern anti-bullying slogans would fiercely defend their knightly titles. Call it play acting at first, he says, but when a child tells you they can't cheat on a test because a knight's word is their bond, you know it's sunk in. The genius lies in translation, replacing archaic terms like fealty with accountability or liege lord with community. Scouting organizations have quietly been doing this for decades. The British Scouts investiture ceremony, where members pledge to help other people at all times, directly echoes the Templar oath to serve the needy without recompense. In Texas, a modified version of the medieval Knights Hospitaller Code shapes a wilderness survival program. Teens learn that building a sturdy shelter is only half the lesson. The other half is offering that shelter to others first. It flips the script, says instructor Miguel Reyes. Suddenly, survival skills aren't just about self-reliance but stewardship. Even corporate training has dipped into this ancient playbook. A Swiss consulting firm starts leadership retreats with a simplified version of the Round Table Oath, framing teamwork as a modern quest. Participants draft charters of honor instead of mission statements, pledging to listen as intently as Gawain listened for the Green Knight's axe. Skeptics might scoff, but the results are measurable. Teams using this approach show a 30% drop in conflict escalations. There's neuroscience at work here. Ritual and narrative activate the brain's emotional centers far more effectively than bullet-pointed policies. The backlash, of course, is inevitable. Critics argue that romanticizing knighthood whitewashes its violent history, or that gendered language excludes. But the programs thriving today are those that confront these complexities head-on. At a Seattle middle school, students debate whether Lancelot's failures make him a cautionary tale or a relatable figure. In Australia, Girl Guide troops rewrite chivalric vows in gender-neutral terms, creating guardian codes that emphasize emotional resilience alongside physical bravery. Perhaps the most poignant proof lies in unexpected places like the Ohio prison, where inmates in a rehabilitation program compose personal oaths based on medieval models. One man's pledge to be a bridge, not a barricade, for his children upon release hangs above his bunk, inked in careful calligraphy. It's a far cry from Arthur's court, yet the through line is unmistakable. The belief that articulating ideals aloud can shape who we become. Whether whispered by a child in a cafeteria or scrawled on prison paper, these modern vows carry forward the old magic. The idea that words, when sworn with solemn intent, can still forge better versions of ourselves. A sword isn't just a weapon, it's a time capsule. When archaeologists uncovered the so-called Sword of Mercy in the ruins of a 12th century chapel, its curved tip told a story far deeper than its blade. This was the ceremonial weapon used in dubbing ceremonies, deliberately blunted to symbolize restraint, a physical manifestation of the knight's oath to use strength wisely. Across Europe, artifacts like this whisper secrets about how vows were woven into the fabric of daily life. Take the Bayeux Tapestry's famous scene where Harold Godwinson swears an oath over relics, his hands hovering above a chest that likely held saintly bones. The embroidery's threads capture more than a moment. They freeze the tension in his shoulders, the solemnity of witnesses, proving these weren't casual promises but performances burned into memory. Manuscripts add another layer to this puzzle. The Morgan Library's copy of the Ordine de Chivalry survives with vivid illuminations showing each step of the knighting ritual. The bath symbolizing purity, the white robe for innocence, the vigil where the candidate knelt all night in silent prayer. But it's the marginal notes, faded scribbles from long-dead owners, that truly breathe life into these pages. One knight's diary entry from 1423 complains about his aching knees after a vigil, reminding us these ideals were lived by flesh and blood people, not storybook heroes. Then there are the rings. Excavations at Montfort Castle revealed simple silver bands inscribed with phrases like "Loyauté sans fin," loyalty without end. These weren't wedding tokens but oath rings given by lords to favored knights as tangible proof of their bond. The British Museum's collection includes one cracked in half, likely deliberately during a ceremony of betrayal, its jagged edges screaming louder than any chronicle about the cost of broken faith. Perhaps most haunting are the relics themselves. In Vienna's Hofburg treasury, a gilded reliquary holds what's purported to be a fragment of the true cross, the very object Frederick Barbarossa swore upon before departing on crusade. To modern eyes, it's just a sliver of wood, but to the emperor, it was a cosmic witness. This blending of the divine and martial reaches its peak in the Espada de San Pedro, a sword displayed in Toledo's cathedral, said to have been wielded by the apostle himself during Christ's arrest. By the 13th century, Spanish knights swore oaths upon it, believing the weapon would judge their honesty. Even music survives as artifact. The Chanson de Roland wasn't just literature. Recent scholarship suggests its repetitive verse structure served as a mnemonic for oath-taking. Imagine a young squire reciting lines by firelight, the rhythm etching promises into muscle memory. At the Musée de Cluny, a carved ivory casket shows Tristan and Isolde exchanging vows while a minstrel plays, proving how deeply performance intertwined with pledge-making. These fragments collectively reveal a startling truth. Medieval oaths weren't just spoken. They were tasted in sacramental wine, felt in the weight of a sword hilt, seen in the flicker of candlelight on gold. Every artifact insists that words alone weren't enough. Loyalty needed texture, scent, sound. When a 21st century historian holds a rusted oath ring, they're not just studying history. For a fleeting moment, through fingerprints left in tarnished silver, they touch the same fears and hopes that once made knights tremble as they swore. Hollywood loves a knight in shining armor, but the truth often tarnishes that polished image. Behind every legendary oath keeper like William Marshal stood a dozen lesser knights who treated their vows like seasonal fashion, changed when inconvenient. Consider the infamous case of Roland de Chatelain, a crusader who swore to protect pilgrims yet became notorious for plundering caravans and throwing prisoners off cliffs. His betrayal wasn't an outlier. Chronicles from the 100 Years' War bristle with accounts of knights switching sides mid-battle, their loyalty swayed by heavier purses or better titles. The romantic myth of universal honor crumbles under historical scrutiny. Take the peace and truce of God movements in 11th century France. Church-led efforts to curb knightly violence. These weren't gentle reminders, they were desperate responses to warlords raiding monasteries and terrorizing peasants despite their chivalric pretensions. Even the church's threat of excommunication often failed to stop oath breakers, proving that for some, earthly power trumped heavenly consequences. Political realities further muddied the waters. When King John of England needed cash, he famously forced his barons to sign the Magna Carta in 1215. But few remember how those same barons had previously broken their own oaths to King Richard. Medieval politics operated like a chessboard where vows were strategic sacrifices, not sacred bonds. The Breton knight Bertrand du Guesclin epitomized this pragmatism. He was captured 6 times in his career, each time conveniently switching allegiance to whoever paid his ransom. Literature of the period reveals a startling self-awareness about these contradictions. The Lancelot Grail cycle doesn't shy from showing Arthur's knights failing their ideals, Gawain slaughtering unarmed men in rage, Lancelot's affair destroying Camelot. These weren't critiques but reflections of a culture that understood the gap between aspiration and reality. Even the Song of Roland, that ultimate ode to loyalty, includes a scene where Charlemagne's army considers abandoning Roland's doomed rearguard until shame, not honor, forces them to act. Modern misconceptions often stem from Victorian-era revisions. Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe and Tennyson's Idylls of the King sanded off chivalry's rough edges, creating a sanitized version where knights were always gallant and oaths never bent. This filtered down to children's tales and eventually to film, leaving us with a distorted lens. The reality, many chivalric vows included loopholes. A knight might swear to protect women, but only noblewomen. Others used religious exemptions, like the Templars who technically kept their poverty vow while amassing wealth through gifts to their order. Yet dismissing chivalry as mere hypocrisy misses the point. Its true power lay in being an ideal so luminous that even failures couldn't extinguish it. When chroniclers condemned oath breakers or troubadours sang of fallen heroes, they weren't exposing a fraud. They were reinforcing a standard. The very fact that medieval society punished vow breaking with such theatrical disgust proves how much the ideal mattered, even when individuals fell short. This duality makes chivalry endlessly fascinating. It wasn't a set of rules people followed perfectly, but a language they used to argue about what it meant to be good. The next time you see a knight's oath in a movie, remember, the real drama wasn't in the perfect keeping of vows, but in the heartbreaking, complicated, all-too-human struggle to live up to them. Thomas Aquinas never swung a sword, but his pen cut deeper than any blade when dissecting the paradox of knightly oaths. In his Summa Theologica, the great theologian posed a question that would haunt armored consciences for centuries. Can a vow made to man be broken if it contradicts divine law? Picture a knight torn between his lord's order to burn a village and his baptismal vow to love thy neighbor. Aquinas argued such conflicts weren't mere inconveniences, they were spiritual battlegrounds where the soul's fate hung in the balance. His solution, a hierarchy of loyalties, God first, conscience second, earthly masters third. This wasn't philosophy for its own sake. It was survival guidance for warriors navigating a world where oaths could strangle as easily as they could elevate. The tension Aquinas identified played out in blood and steel across Europe. Take the case of Sir William de Rose in 1341, who refused his king's command to execute Scottish prisoners, citing his crusader's oath to show mercy. Stripped of lands for disobedience, he became a living lesson in the cost of moral calculus. Yet his contemporary, Sir John Chandos, faced the opposite dilemma during the Breton succession crisis. Bound by oath to two rival lords, he agonized until inventing a third option, donning plain armor to fight for neither, preserving technical honor through neutrality. These men weren't exceptions. They represented a silent struggle pulsing beneath chivalry's polished surface. Even the church's stance held contradictions. While priests preached that oath-breaking damned souls, they also developed elaborate loopholes. A knight could petition the Pope for dispensatio, a formal release from vows if proving the pledge was made under duress or led to sin. The records of Avignon's papal court reveal nobles routinely seeking annulments for inconvenient crusading vows, their petitions laced with creative excuses. This spiritual bureaucracy acknowledged what Aquinas dared say aloud: not all promises deserve keeping. The most fascinating cases emerge when tracing how these ideas trickled down to ordinary knights. Manuscript marginalia show warriors scribbling Aquinas' arguments alongside battle plans, their ink-smudged notes proving ethical wrestling wasn't just for scholars. The Livre de Chivalry by 14th century knight Geoffroy de Charny, a man so revered his skeleton still sits armored in Paris's Saint Denis Basilica, devotes entire chapters to when loyalty must yield to righteousness. His examples cut to the heart of knightly life, refusing orders to pillage churches, disobeying sinful siege tactics, even challenging a liege lord's unjust laws. What emerges isn't the simplistic honor code of Hollywood, but a sophisticated moral ecosystem. Medieval thinkers recognized that oaths gained power not from blind obedience, but from the sacred tension between duty and conscience. When a knight like de Rose chose prisoners over patronage, or when Chandos invented neutral armor, they weren't betraying chivalry, they were fulfilling its highest purpose. The true measure of their honor lay not in which vows they kept, but in how courageously they navigated the spaces between them. Crossing the Pyrenees or the Rhine in the Middle Ages wasn't just a journey through landscapes, it was a passage between entirely different worlds of knighthood. A Spanish caballero riding through the sun-baked plains of Castile lived by a code worlds apart from a German ritter in his mist-shrouded forest fortress, yet both would have bristled at any suggestion they weren't true knights. These regional flavors of chivalry weren't deviations from some universal ideal. They were proof of how brilliantly the concept adapted, bending to local needs without breaking its core spirit. Start with the Spanish caballeros, shaped by the centuries-long Reconquista. Their oaths weren't just about loyalty to a lord, they were covenants with the land itself. A knight swearing fealty to Alfonso VI of Leon might pledge not only military service but to hold no fortress against the king's advance against the Moors. The Furo Codes, those unique municipal charters granted to frontier towns, often required knights to maintain horses and arms at the ready, transforming chivalry into a communal defense pact. Here, the Virgin Mary wasn't just a spiritual figure. She was Santiago Matamoros, St. James the Moor Slayer, whose apparitions on battlefields turned vows into crusades. The legendary Cid's ability to fight under both Christian and Muslim banners wasn't treason but a reflection of Iberia's complex reality, where pragmatism and piety constantly negotiated. France's chevaliers, by contrast, wrapped knighthood in layers of courtly ritual. In the Loire Valley's glittering courts, a vow wasn't complete without the adubment's theatrical touches, the ceremonial bath symbolizing purity, the white robe for innocence, the midnight vigil where a squire's knees ached on cold chapel stones. But beneath the pageantry lurked hard politics. When a Burgundian knight swore to his duke, the oath included clauses about not building rival castles, a nod to feudalism's fragile power balances. The Chanson de Roland might sing of absolute loyalty, but real French knights like Bertrand du Guesclin famously switched sides during the 100 Years' War, their oaths flexing with the tides of advantage. Yet even then, the forms were sacred. Breaking faith required a formal diffidatio ceremony, where a snapped twig or returned glove made the rupture official. German Ritter carved their own path in the dense woodlands of the Holy Roman Empire. Their Lanesade fealty oath was less about personal loyalty to a king than a chain of obligations binding lord to vassal to serf. A Teutonic knight pledging to hold fast to Christ and the order in Marienburg Castle wasn't just joining a brotherhood, he was becoming a cog in a machine that conquered Prussia. The Minnesänger poets added another layer, their songs blending martial oaths with almost mystical devotion to noblewomen. Listen to Walther von der Vogelweid's lyrics, "I swore to serve her till my dying day, though she never knows my name," and you hear how German chivalry entwined love and duty until they were indistinguishable. These regional quirks weren't just cultural footnotes, they dictated life and death decisions. A Spanish knight caught between two oaths might consult the Sayat Partida's legal code's hierarchy of loyalties. A French knight knew that breaking his parole d'honneur after surrender meant eternal disgrace, while his German counterpart might prioritize true, a concept closer to cosmic order than personal promise. Yet for all their differences, a shared thread ran through them, the understanding that a knight's word, once given, became part of his flesh. Whether sworn on a Quran in Toledo's Alcazar, a fragment of the true cross in Paris's Sainte-Chapelle, or Odin's spear in some converted Saxon hall, these vows all pointed toward the same North Star, that honor wasn't just what you did, but who you were. The beauty of these variations lies in their refusal to reduce chivalry to a checklist. Like dialects of a shared language, they prove that ideals gain strength when they bend without breaking. A caballero defending a pyre lit auto da fe, a chevalier composing verses to his untouched lady, a ritter carving a cross into Baltic oak, each was answering the same call, just in the accent of their homeland. That adaptability, far from weakening knighthood, made it immortal. Long after castles crumbled, these regional flavors would linger like spices in history's stew, reminding us that the truest vows aren't those recited identically, but those lived authentically. The gleaming armor of the condottieri wasn't polished for honor, it reflected the cold calculus of contracts. These Italian mercenary captains of the 14th and 15th centuries carried titles of knighthood but answered to a different god, coin. Unlike William Marshal or Godfrey of Bouillon, who swore oaths on relics and land, a condottier's pledge was scribbled on parchment with clauses for payment deadlines and breach penalties. When Sir John Hawkwood, the Englishman who became Italy's most feared mercenary, led his White Company, his men followed not out of feudal duty, but because his reputation guaranteed plunder. Their battles weren't crusades, they were carefully choreographed spectacles where ransoming prisoners often proved more profitable than killing. this mercenary mindset turned chivalry inside out. Traditional knights saw warfare as sacred, their swords consecrated like priests' vestments. But for the condottieri, combat was a marketplace. They pioneered tactics that maximized profit over glory, like battaglia scompigliata, disordered battle, where they'd feign retreat to exhaust enemies, then negotiate surrender terms mid-chaos. The infamous Carmagnola once halted a charge because his contract didn't cover fighting in rain. To feudal purists, this was heresy. Yet these mercenaries weren't mere thugs. Many, like Federico da Montefeltro, were Renaissance men who commissioned masterpieces while their armies stalled sieges to extend payroll. The church railed against these knights without crosses, but even popes hired them. When condottiere Braccio da Montone besieged Rome in 1416, his contract included absolution for any sacrilege, a literal license to sin. Here lay the irony. The very institution that preached against mercenaries became their best client. The Papal States ledgers reveal payments to condottieri sporting titles like Defender of the Faith, their piety conveniently proportional to their retainers. What truly unsettled contemporaries wasn't the condottieri's violence, but their transparency. Unlike feudal knights who draped ambition in oaths, mercenaries made no pretense. Their loyalty had price tags, not expiration dates. When Venice's Senate debated hiring Francesco Sforza, they didn't discuss his honor, they audited his success rate. This brutal pragmatism birthed modern military contracting, where allegiance follows funding, not flags. Yet even these mercenaries couldn't escape chivalry's shadow. Many commissioned elaborate tombs depicting themselves in pious knightly postures, their swords pointing heavenward. Hawkwood's Florentine monument shows him nobly astride a steed, not counting coins. The condottieri craved the legitimacy their profession mocked, proving that even the most cynical warriors couldn't shake the dream of being more than hired blades. Their legacy whispers an uncomfortable truth. Knighthood was never just about vows or valor. It was about the stories we insist on telling, even when reality cuts deeper than any sword. By the time Michelangelo was chiseling David and Leonardo sketching flying machines, the armored knight had become something between a relic and a joke. The world was changing. Gunpowder had rendered plate armor obsolete, and nation-states were replacing feudal loyalties with professional armies. Yet in this twilight of chivalry, a curious thing happened. Knighthood didn't die. It fractured, with some strands fading into parody while others reinvented themselves with startling resilience. Enter Don Quixote, Cervantes' deluded hero tilting at windmills in rusty armor. Published in 1605, the novel wasn't just entertainment, it was a eulogy for an era. Quixote's mad insistence on living by outdated codes exposed the absurdity of clinging to ideals the world had abandoned. His famous oath to Dulcinea, a peasant girl he imagines as a noble lady, lays bare the gap between romantic delusion and reality. Yet for all its satire, there's tragedy in his quest. When Quixote swears to defend the helpless and right all wrongs, we laugh at his folly, but part of us aches for the purity of his conviction. Meanwhile, on the sun-baked island of Malta, a very different kind of knight was proving that chivalry could adapt without losing its soul. The Knights Hospitaller, having lost their last foothold in Rhodes to the Ottomans in 1522, transformed themselves into naval warriors. Their galleys became floating monasteries where oaths to care for the sick and fight the infidel now meant running hospitals aboard ship and battling Barbary pirates. These weren't nostalgic throwbacks, but innovators. Their fortifications at Valletta incorporated the latest star-shaped designs to deflect cannon fire. Their medical practices revolutionized battlefield surgery. The contrast between Quixote's comic irrelevance and the Hospitaller's gritty persistence reveals a truth about ideals. They don't expire, but they must evolve. Consider the ceremonial knights of Elizabethan England, like Sir Walter Raleigh, who traded battlefield oaths for courtly ones. His pledge to Elizabeth I, to explore, to colonize, to glorify your name, was feudal loyalty repackaged for the age of exploration. Or the French Order of St. Michael, where members swore to defend the arts and letters, turning swords into patronage pens. Even the church recalibrated. When the Teutonic Knights secularized their Prussian lands in 1525, they didn't abandon their vows, they reinterpreted them. Their new oath required members to govern justly and promote learning, transforming crusaders into administrators. Similarly, Spain's Order of Santiago kept its sword-shaped cross but redirected members toward protecting pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago, their martial duty now a tourist safeguard. What unites these Renaissance reinventions is their refusal to let formality hollow out meaning. The Knights of Malta didn't just wear their 8-pointed crosses as jewelry, they earned them through grueling naval service. When a new initiate swore his vows in their candlelit chapel, he wasn't reciting empty words, he was signing up to face Ottoman cannonades and plague-ridden galleys. Their survival into the 18th century, long after most orders faded, proves that chivalry's core could endure when stripped of nostalgia and retooled for real-world needs. The lesson for us isn't about armor or oaths, but about how traditions stay alive. Whether it's modern militaries invoking honor codes or hospitals using the Hospitaller cross, the spirit of knighthood survives where people take its underlying values: service, courage, integrity, and find new ways to live them. Quixote's mistake wasn't believing in ideals, it was freezing them in amber. The true heirs of chivalry weren't those who clung to its trappings, but those who understood that a vow's power lies not in the words themselves, but in the willingness to remake them for each new battlefield. The idea of knighthood didn't vanish when the last castle fell, it simply traded its armor for a suit and tie. Modern organizations like the Knights of Columbus, founded in 1882, carry the torch of chivalry into the 21st century, swapping swords for soup kitchens and jousting tournaments for charity galas. With over 2 million members worldwide, this Catholic fraternal order doesn't just recite oaths, they live them through scholarship funds, disaster relief, and medical research. Their pledge to protect the vulnerable might not involve rescuing damsels from towers, but funding ultrasound machines for pregnancy centers fulfills that same spirit in a world where battles are fought with compassion rather than broadswords. Across the Atlantic, Britain's Order of St. John, descended directly from the medieval Hospitallers, proves that ancient vows can adapt without losing their soul. Their ambulances still bear the 8-pointed Maltese cross, but instead of defending pilgrims from Saracens, their volunteers administer first aid at concerts and train community responders in CPR. The ceremonial robes and titles might seem like quaint relics until you witness their members navigating disaster zones or running eye camps in remote villages. Here's the twist: their Chivalry in Action programs have reduced preventable blindness in Malawi by 40%, a crusade against suffering that would make Godfrey of Bouillon proud. Even secular groups have embraced this legacy. The International Fellowship of Chivalry, now a diverse collective of educators and activists, reinterprets knightly codes for modern ethics. Their members don't swear on Bibles or relics but pledge to combat injustice through daily acts of integrity, whether that's whistleblowing corporate corruption or mentoring at-risk youth. Founder D. Joseph Jacques frames it as armor for the soul, where a knight's shield might be a smartphone documenting police misconduct and their lance a viral social justice campaign. The most surprising revival might be in Silicon Valley, where tech executives are turning to chivalry as an antidote to cutthroat corporate culture. Startups like Knightly, yes, really use Arthurian principles in leadership training, framing teamwork as a round table and data security as guarding the kingdom's treasures. When a Fortune 500 CEO invokes Lancelot's loyalty during a merger, it's not just quirky, it's a recognition that trust still holds empires together, even digital ones. What unites these modern knights isn't nostalgia, but a shared understanding that the core of chivalry was never about the weapons or the pageantry. It was about creating bonds stronger than law, deeper than profit, the kind of promises that turn strangers into protectors and communities into brotherhoods. Whether through a Masonic lodge's charity drives or a neighborhood watch organizer invoking Sir Gawain's vigilance, the DNA of those medieval oaths still shapes how we aspire to treat one another. The armor rusted away, but the heartbeat remains, that a life built on service and sworn integrity isn't just history, it's a compass for the future. The stories of these knights and their sacred vows linger in our collective memory, not because of their swords or shining armor, but because of the weight they gave to their word. In a world where promises can feel disposable, cancelled with a text, forgotten in the rush of daily life, there's something magnetic about people who treated their oaths as unshakable truths. The medieval knight who knelt before his lord wasn't just performing a ritual, he was binding himself to something greater than his own desires. And while we no longer swear fealty on relics or ride into battle, that same hunger for meaning and connection still pulses through our lives today. Consider how chivalry's DNA has seeped into the modern world. When a doctor takes the Hippocratic Oath, they're echoing the knight's pledge to protect the vulnerable. The soldier who raises their hand to serve isn't so different from a squire swearing to his liege. Even the simple act of holding a door for a stranger carries a whisper of that old ideal strength used in service of kindness. These aren't outdated relics, they're proof that the core of chivalry, honor, duty, sacrifice transcends time. Literature and film keep these ideals alive, not as history lessons but as mirrors. When we watch Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings refuse the crown until he's earned it, or Tony Stark lay down his life to save the universe, we're seeing medieval vows reborn in new armor. These stories resonate because they remind us that heroism isn't about perfection. It's about choosing again and again to keep faith with something bigger than ourselves. The knights of old stumbled, betrayed, and fell short just as we do. Their power lies not in their purity, but in their persistence. So what does chivalry look like today? It might be the teacher who stays late to help a struggling student, the neighbor who checks in on the elderly widow down the street, or the whistleblower who risks everything to expose injustice. It lives in small, uncelebrated acts, the choice to listen when it's easier to interrupt, to stand up when it's safer to stay silent. You don't need a title or a sword to live by a code. You only need to decide what matters enough to pledge yourself to it, fully and without reservation. The age of knights may be long gone, but the questions they grappled with remain urgent. How do we balance loyalty with conscience? When must we break tradition to serve truth? Their stories don't give us easy answers, but they light the path. As you close this chapter, think of the vows you've made to loved ones, to principles, to your own conscience. Whether whispered or unspoken, these are the threads that weave our lives into something enduring. The world may no longer need shield walls and charging steeds, but it will always need people brave enough to give their word and stubborn enough to keep it.